Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Love you too, Billy Spain. Anyway, I want to say thank you for everyone that's here tonight, and in particular, before I go any further, let's give a round of applause for our law enforcement officials that are here tonight, because that is incredibly important, particularly in the time that we're in today. But I want to start by saying something here first. And a friend of mine called me yesterday and they asked me, are you anxious about being at CivicCon tomorrow night? Because really this is the first time locally that I have really did a talk in front of a local crowd. Well, one other time for CivicCon, I believe it was. But this is the second one. So I don't do this very often at home. It's usually out of state or wherever. So they asked me if I was anxious about being here tonight. And I said, no, not at all. And about 3 o'clock this morning, I woke up and I realized I'm terrified about being here tonight. Now, I'm going to make it through this because you have to understand something. When you're speaking out of town, you can say whatever you want with reckless abandon and with impunity and run to the airport, get on the plane, people never see you again. The problem here in Pensacola, half of y'all in the room know where I live, and the other half I'll run into at the Publix on 12th and Cervantes, so I have to be very careful what I say. But thank you for being here. This is important. This is a very important moment in America's history, and everything we're going to talk about tonight is America's history. But let me start by saying this, and this is critically and very important for this night and for you, is that I want you to take your lenses off tonight in terms of how you see and experience the world around you. Because we all have our own perception, our own experiences, and our own ideas about how things are for us. But it becomes incumbent for all of us, and I don't care whether you're black or white or Democrat or Republican, gay or straight, Muslim or Christian, we all come with a variety different of things about ourselves who make us who we are, and we all have had different experiences in this country. Because I'm going to ask you to do this because it's going to be important that as we go to the next 30 to 45 minutes, is that I want you to have the courage to move from a place of feeling safe. For me, it's easy for me to feel safe where I am because I see the world that I do and it fits in everything I need it to fit into. But I come to realize over the years that there are people who have a very different experience than myself, even people who are of color as myself. We can look around the room and we see a diverse crowd in here tonight. The person sitting next to you may be white, they may be black, you may be similar in many ways, maybe you go to the same church, maybe you're married, whatever the case may happen to be, but each and every one of you have had a different experience. You've had a different journey. And we cannot determine what that journey was for anyone just by merely looking at them, because we're much more sophisticated than that. So take your lenses off tonight as you listen and begin to question, how is this experience must be for someone else other than myself? Just for a few minutes. There's going to be some points in here where I'm going to take you into some deep water. And I'm going to tell you that so that you don't throw those lenses back on, because each and every person in here may feel a little uncomfortable. But I don't want to leave something with you that you just hear. I want to leave something with you that you feel, because that's where the real learning takes place. But we have to be willing to challenge ourselves, and we have to be willing to have courage. And courage is very challenging and difficult at times. One of the most important things that I've learned over the years as a law enforcement professional, I grew up right here in Pensacola, Florida. I grew up at a very conservative time in American history in the 60s. I grew up where now was referred to East Hill. It was an African-American community out there that spanned some parts of East Hill. Everyone that I knew, parents were either professional or they were blue-collar workers working at a plant somewhere in this city that made something for this country. Everybody had a nice house, clean yard, car in their garage, etc. And we all graduated and we all finished high school and went off to do a number of wonderful things. That was my conservative experience growing up in North Florida. But when I moved into law enforcement, I realized that some of the prejudice and biases that came with my upbringing got drawn into my profession of policing with me. And I never will forget one of the first calls for service I ever took in Tallahassee, Florida, right near Doak Campbell Stadium. Is it still called Doak Campbell Stadium? Mm-hmm. Right there on Pensacola Street, call for service, domestic, two gay white males having an argument. I grew up in the 60s. If you were gay, you better not tell anybody because it was not socially acceptable. I learned and took on messages that were things that today I would be embarrassed by. For me, it was around being homophobic. For someone else, it may be around race or gender or religious preference. But the reality of it is that we all have these biases, and when we're in public service, we have to have the ability to acknowledge them so that we can grow and learn and serve the people in which we're sworn to protect. On that particular night, with those two particular people, I was harsh, I was rude, I was over the top, and all of my stuff came out. So for me, throughout early on in my career, I had to learn how to do something different. But we all have these biases. But when we talk about policing in America, it becomes important that we understand that policing in America is complicated. It is not simplistic as oftentimes we like to think that it is. Because the people who make up the profession are the same people like myself and others who have to integrate into a larger world and bring our stuff with us. But the history of policing is what we have to think about before we talk anything about how we begin to rethink policing in this country. Because we need to rethink it. It needs to be re-engineered. Because we have American people across this country, not just in black and brown communities, but across this entire country that's saying that something different has to happen in American policing. When we see disparate treatments, when we see disparate shootings of African American men and women in this country, we cannot ignore it, but at the same time, we got to learn and move from it. So it becomes incumbent and it becomes very important as we begin to, how do we rethink policing? That means a lot. What does that mean? I can stand here all night and tell you about how to rethink it, how to re-engineer policing in and of itself. But we got to go back to the history of policing in this country. We got to understand where it came from. And long before George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all these names that we have become too familiar with, Tamir Rice, Orlando Castillo, I can name 100 names of people in recent time who have died at the hands of police that has created great question, great pause, great concern. So we need to understand the history of policing. We need to understand how it evolved and how it came into this nation and how it was introduced. The very first police department was actually 3,000 years ago in Egypt. You got to dig deep to find that piece of history. But long before those persons who lost their life, who bring us to this point of rethinking police, because this is what it's all about. A delivery or service that doesn't have the appearance of being fair and equitable to everyone. I'm getting ready to go into deep water here. In 1704, the state of South Carolina enacted slave patrols. Those slave patrols went on for over 100 years. Their primary purpose, even before the Revolution, up to the Revolution and beyond, was to bring slaves back to their owners, those who were rebelling against slavery and those who wished to run away. And when they were caught by slave patrol, they were beaten and even killed. That was one piece of the beginning of how policing was defined in this country. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, thereabout, slave patrols died off. But in comes black codes and slave codes that were written in many southern states to still keep a free people marginalized. And then years later, not too much longer, we move into Jim Crow in this country. And from Jim Crow grew the Ku Klux Klan, which was oftentimes well participated by police departments in this country. They were part of being part of the Klan. You go back to the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi, police was involved. And it goes on and on. This is undeniable history that cannot be refuted. But you need to understand the basic and the fundamental purpose of what I'm saying here is that throughout the history of policing, it has been challenging in communities of color. So we come up through the Civil Rights era. We come up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We still saw disparities across this country. We saw riots in 1965 in Los Angeles, California, a result of 2 black men being stopped by LAPD and treated abusively. And then we went on to see the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, where we saw riots take place. And then we went on, we saw a number of riots over a number of cities over a period of time, which often clashed with the police. In 1992, we saw Rodney King that was played out on TV 100 times over. And then we witnessed, even just prior to that, when I was in Miami in 1980, was the Miami riots. And that came off as a result of 6 white men who beat a black man to death on a motorcycle and tried to cover it up and call it an automobile accident. They were indicted but acquitted by a 6-man all-white jury in Hillsborough County, and Miami burned up. Many of you in here would probably be too young to remember that. But the connection and the one thread that runs through all this violence has been police and community. And then we can bring it all the way up to Michael Brown. We can bring it up to Orlando Castile. We can bring it up to the horrible tragedy that we all witnessed last year on May 20th, and that was of George Floyd. Communities of color and police. And the question becomes, because of the history of policing in this nation, we have decided, myself, other professional organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Police Executive Research Forum, NOBLE, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers, and major city chiefs, we all come to one conclusion. We have to acknowledge our past if we want to move our profession forward. But the key is not to get stuck there. The key is to recognize it, acknowledge it, and then how do we move forward?
Amen. Amen.
Because we cannot reconcile what happened in the past, but what we can do, in spite of all this divisiveness that we feel that we're living in today in this country, we have to keep our lenses off and make an attempt to look at life and experience through the lives of others. Every police officer in this country is not a bad police officer. Let me get that out the way. They're hardworking men and women who go to work every day in this community, in this state, and across this country to do the very best that they can to uphold the Constitution that they took. Do we have bad actors? Yes, we do. But name me one profession that don't have bad actors. But one of the most important things we have to remember about policing is that it has a power and authority that no other profession has. That's the ability to take a life if it's justifiable, and the ability to take your fundamental right of freedom away from you. That is a lot of power, a lot of authority, and people expect from us a great deal of transparency, a great deal of responsibility, and an openness and a willingness to connect with communities across this country. That is hugely important. We cannot go back and change the past. We can't control what happened yesterday, but what we can do is have an influence on what's going to happen tomorrow. I talk to a lot of chiefs and sheriffs and mayors across this country. Everyone is in the same place struggling with the same ideas to how do I create a better police department? How do I begin to rethink policing in this country? How do I begin to understand that in my community, regardless of what its history may happen to be, but in communities, even in communities of poor whites, disparate behaviors and attitudes are projected on them. No one can escape people acting out in a way that harm other people and attempt to hide behind it under the color of law. I've hired a lot of police officers in my life, and I've fired a lot of police officers in my life. And I also have stood by a lot of police officers in my life who had to make a crucial decision of life and death, and it was not popular to do. But right will always overcome wrong. And we have a moral and ethical responsibility in the profession of policing. You as citizens in this city and across this country have a moral and responsible and an ethical responsibility to understand that in order for our communities to be safe, if any parts of our community don't feel safe, then none of us are safe. It takes all of us in order to provide public safety in this country. We should expect the best from our law enforcement. We should expect transparency and accountability. But there's several areas that I want to talk about tonight that I think that are crucially important. And one of the first that is really important in this world we live in today that is very complex, very convoluted, very divided, very technologically oriented. We have immigration issues. We have a broad array of social issues in this country, from mental health to homelessness to poor education and to a lack of public and affordable housing. All these variables are a part of public safety. Police is not the only in and of itself just public safety. It is one of the elements. Law enforcement is public safety. Mental health is public safety. Homelessness is public safety. Lead poisoning in your schools and in your homes is public safety. Homelessness is public safety. Domestic violence is public safety. Any and every social ill that you can think of, including pandemics, is public safety. Amen. But in order for us to be able to engage these different challenges that we're in front of, we have to recognize and come to terms with the fact that for too many years, we have been asking police to fix each and every one of them. And it ain't happening, and it's not going to happen. So let's talk about training. Let's talk about recruitment. Let's start with recruitment. One of the most important elements I've learned over the last number of years when it comes to if you want to do something with your department that takes you beyond just being average, look at who you're hiring. Let's think about recruiting for a moment in this very sophisticated society that we live in. We need men and women today who understand the essence and the importance of critical thinking. And I'm not just talking about critical thinking in terms of shoot and don't shoot scenarios. I'm talking about critical thinking in the terms that officer goes to in a house to respond to a call. And he or she have to make decisions based on what's in front of them around a variety of different things. They got to be able to think critically and in depth. They got to be able to organize information quickly. Because nothing in our society today comes easy. It's complex, it's convoluted. We need to hire men and women not just because they have a good driving record, or they give me 4 or 5 names as references, they got a great credit score, and their background is great. I need to dig deeper. When we talk about recruiting men and women into our police departments and sheriff's offices and law enforcement today, we are not just looking for average folks anymore, because there's nothing average about this world we're living in.
Amen. Amen to that.
We need thinkers, we need doers, and we need people who have a compassion for human life. 80% of policing in this country is not running and gunning. 80% of policing in this country is about building relationships in communities that we live and we work in. There are a lot of bad people in the world, and there's a lot of bad people that's going to have to be confronted and engaged. But the greatest majority of work that we do as police officers is building and attempting to build and maintain relationships, because that's one of the most important crime-fighting tools we will ever have.
Amen.
We will ever have. But we also have to be mindful of the history in building those relationships in many communities. People who still today feel they cannot trust police, not based on 100 or 200 years ago, but based on the last incident that we saw that created a great deal of pause and concern for all of us. We're constantly living through this. If you look at the videos that are running behind me, you see a variety of pictures. Pictures from your local sheriff's office, pictures from other departments across the world of agencies and police departments that are beginning to realize the importance of building those relationships. Meeting with young men and women, allowing them an opportunity to reach out and feel and touch and want to be police officers themselves. Many of these kids will go on to be. Many of them, probably most of them, will not. But here's what the benefit of what happens when you have these type of programs, when you have this type of involvement. We build good citizens, Bill Spain. We build Americans. We build kids who learn how to understand the importance that laws mean something. They may not go on to become police officers, but they will go on to become good citizens. These are the young men and women we want to recruit into our agencies today. We want young men and women also who understand the importance and the ability to embrace differences and diversity. Many of our young millennials today and generations X, Y, and Z, wherever we happen to be now, one advantage that they have over what I had growing up as a baby boomer, they have access to diversity all around the world via social media. I grew up on the east side of Pensacola. All my friends looked just like me. But today, your children and your grandchildren got a variety of different friends.
Amen.
a variety of different relationships, and I don't care whether they grew up in Addicts Court or they grew up in Jay, Florida. They all have a different experience in relationships with people who are different than them, than what it was in my generation, and many of you that are in this room. They understand the importance of embracing diversity. They've had gay friends ever since middle school. I didn't know I had a gay friend until I was 40. But there's the difference. Our children are young, they're smart, they're technologically advanced. They want to be part of something in which they can provide a service. But what they also are very sensitive to is the idea that diversity is a strength and not a weakness of this community and of this nation.
Amen. Amen.
And what they look from us as we recruit them into the profession, we now have to train them. And training becomes an essential part of this whole process of reimagining police, because we got to think about how are we training and role modeling to young men and women how to be good public servants, how to be responsible public servants. This is not all about running and gunning and fighting, all the sexy stuff in law enforcement we see sometimes. This is about building relationships, so hopefully I don't have to run and gun. But we know we got bad people in our society, and people that have to be dealt with appropriately and sometimes effectively. But the greatest majority of calls for service out there in this community and communities across this country are calls for service who people need some immediate help where there may not necessarily be a threat. But we also know we have an emerging issue in this country called mental health that we all are confronted with every day. When we talk about training, on average, police officers can receive 60 hours of firearm training and roughly 58 hours of ground fighting, self-defense training. You know how much training they get in building relationships? It's minuscule. It is minuscule. But we have elevated ourselves. We have moved forward. We have created diversity training, bias training, de-escalation training, all this training that has come about, particularly in recent years, post some of these events that I talked about, that is allowing us to train our officers better. I can recruit well, but also have to train well. But the best training any young recruit will ever get is the role modeling that is set by these administrators and everybody down their chain to the last person hired.
Amen.
It's what we role model.
Leadership.
It's leadership. That's what people want. That's what young people want. But we have to understand, and in this age of this new millennial, these young people, if they decide to come into the profession, their expectations of leadership from me and others is going to be paramount as determined as to whether they're going to stay in the profession or they're going to get out. There are a number of police organizations will say to you, well, young people don't want to be police officers anymore because of the way that they're being treated by the general public. There may be a certain level of truth to that. But it's also a certain level of truth that many of them don't want to be police officers because of the way they see that we treat people. And particularly young people today. And we also have to accept the notion that many young people that we train today, they're not going to stay in this profession very long. That is a trend that cuts across all industries in this country. And policing is no different. So we have to have a constant pipeline of young people who want to protect and to serve and be public officials. We got to recruit well and we got to train well. And I can send you to de-escalation training. I can send you to all these trainings. But I have to come up now with a way in which I can measure the effectiveness of what it is that you're doing in this training. Because if I can't measure it, then I don't know what we got. So it's very popular today for police officers to go to de-escalation training. I can go to de-escalation training, I can check the box, I leave, and I go take the next call for service, and I don't utilize any of those skill sets that I've learned. We got to be able to utilize our technology today to reinforce the training that we're giving to our officers. Body-worn cameras is not just to make sure that officers are doing what they're supposed to be doing, or the public is saying something about officers that is not true or could be true. That technology also can be used by supervisors. Those who go to a call of service with me and see that I utilize those de-escalation skills can come back and take that piece of video and sit down with me and say, hey, Officer Alexander, here's what you did well on that call. You're reinforcing positive behaviors. Or here's what you could have done better or different. That's why training is important. That's why the utilization of technology in our training is important. It's accessible, it's there for us. In most departments across this country, when you start talking about firearms training, it's minuscule. Twice a year, I have to go out and qualify in order to maintain my post standard, police officer standard and training certification. That is qualification. That is not training. We got to find ways to build into our police officers and our departments, find ways in which they will have more time to do critical thinking when it comes to an armed situation. Because skills that are not used are skills that are lost, and particularly in very critical situations. We have to utilize the technology that is in front of us today in order to advance policing into the future. We can no longer do what we used to do. If a young man or woman is assigned to me and I'm their field training officer, once they get out of the academy, that's one of the most important parts, that's one of the most important pieces in law enforcement and public safety today, that I role model to him and her an expectation and a behavior that will be accepted. Cedric Chauvin on May 20th, when he put his knee into the neck of George Floyd, down at the foot of George Floyd was Officer Lane. Officer Lane said to senior 19-year veteran Cedric Chauvin, shouldn't we roll him over? Officer Lane was 4 days out of FTO training. He didn't even complete a week of work before he was fired and charged. Senior officer, 19-year veteran. And in police culture, seniority trumps the day. But I know to this very moment, because I spoke with Officer Lane, professors at the University of Minnesota when I was doing some work there shortly after all of this. They knew Lane. They knew him as a good student. And it traumatized that entire Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Minnesota. But Lane had a compassion for human life, something that Cedric Chauvin was totally absent of. And he did his very best, 4 days, and having him complete a year of work. Shouldn't we roll him over? We have to train today in our police departments and to change this culture. Change this culture that, yes, we have bad apples, but if I'm a good officer, and that's a bad officer, and I allow him or her to carry on and act out and do the things that they do, then I am complicit. If I say nothing, if I do nothing. So now in police departments, they're writing policies around, if you see an officer do something wrong, you should report it. That shouldn't be a policy. That should be in here. That's humanity. That's compassion for human life. It doesn't have to be written. Policies do not change the culture of police departments in this country. Policies get eaten for breakfast in police departments. Because policy is just a written document, but if it's not reinforced or enforced, then it is meaningless. So as we begin to rethink policing in this country, we think about recruiting, we think about training. The things that we need to do to elevate our training, to make sure that when we send our men and women out there equipped with everything that we have, we got to give them good salaries and good benefits. We have to make sure that they're healthy. And we have to hold them to a higher standard. Communities don't work for the police. Police work for communities, but it is, according to the father of law enforcement, Sir Robert Peel, 1822, London, England, stood up the first police department there. Police are the community, and the community is the police. It is a joint effort. I will never be able to keep your community safe by myself.
Amen. Amen.
It takes the collective efforts of an entire community. It takes police and community working together, genuinely, authentically, regularly. And that's the type of culture you have to be able to provide. And it has to be role modeled not just by the chief or the sheriff. It has to be role modeled by everyone that's in that chain of command, right down to the last person hired. So the ultimate responsibility that we all have, let's recruit different. Let's recruit with people who have a compassion for human life, who are smart and thoughtful and critical thinkers. Let's train well. Let's give our officers and deputies the opportunities to get as much training as they can and hold them accountable to the training, utilizing the technology we have in front of us today to help reinforce positive behavior. And then one of the most critical things out of all that, we have to be able to provide good supervision, good leadership. Because as we look toward the future of policing in this country, none of this is going to get done without good leadership. First line leadership, sergeants. One day you're a patrolman, next day you're a sergeant. And in police culture, oftentimes there's no training that goes with you becoming a sergeant or a lieutenant or a captain. But we have to find ways to train. And with police officers, if there's one thing that they want, more than anything else, they want to be well trained. I want them to be able to shoot. I want them to be able to fight. But I also want them to be able to build relationships and understand that the importance of the community's safety and their own safety is embedded in the whole idea that you're a part of this community and this community is part of you. Because we want everybody to go home.
Amen. Amen.
Everybody.
Amen.
Supervision is critical. Training and supervision and leadership is critical. There is no end point to training. We have to constantly train. We have to build that memory muscle, whether it's administrator or executive or the cop that's on the street directing traffic. We're constantly evolving. We're constantly learning. And we're constantly role modeling the attitudes that we want our men and women to have. Community has a responsibility.
Amen.
I'm finna go into some deep water again. Too often in many of our communities across this country, we can no longer sit back and blame police for what they're not doing or what they could have done better. We also, as community members across this country, have some shared responsibility of doing better in our own communities. Playing an active role, doing something that mentor young people, not being critical all the time of what you don't have and what did not happen, but what is it that I can do from where I am? How do I partner with law enforcement? We can't go back and bring back the lives of these people who lost their lives at the hands of police. But what we can do is make sure that it doesn't happen again. It's about where we're going to now. And as I get ready to close here, I think it's critically important that the one takeaway I want you to be able to understand here tonight is that in policing and during my time with the 21st Century Task Force, we created a document that provided a roadmap to this country and American policing that was adopted by many departments across this country and still being utilized today. And there were two important things in that document that stood out most for me. Of the 6 chapters, the 6 pillars that was written, the very first was building trust and legitimacy. In their lives, building that trust, building that legitimacy with your community, in their lives, good public safety. But as we go forward in American policing, we're really going to have to define what it is that we want our men and women to do. But they can't do everything. And we've asked them to do too much with the least amount of training. We need to find what we want them to do. We need to train them up to where we want them to be. We need to pay them. We need to compensate them. We need to make sure they got good benefits. And then we need to hold them accountable. And we need agencies that are going to be transparent. But we also need you in your communities to be able to stand with them.
Amen. Amen.
Because they're doing a job that many people don't want to do. And regardless of what we think about policing, however we rethink it, however we re-engineer it, we need police, but we need good police. We need professional policing. We need compassionate policing, but also need men and women who are capable of protecting you and protecting me. But their decision making is based on experience and training and the ability to acknowledge that we all have biases that we got to attend to and raise to a level of consciousness. This is a national issue, which makes it a local issue. And the only way that we're going to move forward in policing in this country in a way that we can join hands and reconnect with each other, may connect with each other for the first time, it starts with trust. It starts with legitimacy. And that's all legitimacy is trust. You can give me a gun and a badge. You can give me authority under the state of Florida to carry out the functions of a law enforcement officer. But it is the community who gives you legitimacy. It is the community who does that. Work hard. Each and every one of you in this room, work hard with your local law enforcement. Take nothing for granted. We all have work to do, but we got to build trust. And the only way we do that is we have to engage, and we have to engage honestly. We got to applaud our police departments when they do things right, and we have to challenge them to always work to be better. And we as communities across this city and across this country, we also have a responsibility to be involved in our communities, to be able to call when we see something wrong, and we ourselves not be complicit and harbor those that need to be out of our communities. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you tonight.